Welcome, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's discussion on priorities for the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan Elliott. I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And I want to thank you for joining us today in what I know is going to be a very interesting discussion about what our priorities are for the Indo-Pacific. We think today's program, although we planned it a while ago, we think today's program is particularly important because of the recent first ever head of state level meeting of the Quad member states. So today we're going to discuss the challenges and the issues that face the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. While remaining short of a formal alliance, the grouping of these key regional democracies has the ability to plan and organize significant collective action in areas of common interest. So that's what we'd like to do today, is discuss with representatives from all countries, what we see are the priorities, the areas of common interest, and the challenges that we face. As you can see, we've gathered a distinguished group of experts from each of the 4 countries to discuss the issues. So now I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator for today's discussion, Susan Thornton. For those of you who perhaps don't know Susan, she's the project director of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Forum on Asia-Pacific Security. Susan joined us at the NCAFP in January of 2020 after a distinguished diplomatic career at the U.S. Department of State, where she focused primarily on East and Central Asia. And she was a great colleague to me when I was at State Department. So we're very fortunate not only to have her lead our discussion tonight, but lead our Forum on Asia-Pacific Security. So Susan will introduce our panelists to you and moderate this discussion. So over to you, Susan.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. And I have to say, I have really been looking forward to tonight's discussion. It is, as you mentioned, very timely. We've had such a flurry of diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific by the new Biden administration, our Secretary of State, our Secretary of Defense, and of course, as you mentioned, Susan, the President Biden meeting virtually with his Quad counterparts just 10 days ago. First, let me introduce who we have on our terrific panel tonight to discuss all that's going on in the Indo-Pacific and with the Quad. We have Professor Yuichi Hosoya. He is a professor of international politics in the Faculty of Law at the Keio University in Tokyo. He's also a senior researcher at the Nakasone Peace Institute, senior fellow at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research, and a senior adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. We also have with us Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. He is the founder and executive director of the Observer Research Foundation's America branch. He's located currently in Washington, D.C., but he is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Australia and a columnist for the Hindustan Times. And he was previously a fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies at Brookings, India in New Delhi. We also have with us, coming all the way from Australia, Professor Rory Metcalf. He's the head of the National Security College at Australia National University, and he has a varied professional background involving 3 decades of experience. He was a former Australian diplomat. He was a former Australian intelligence analyst, and he has also worked at think tanks and in academia and journalism, including as the founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute from 2007 to 2015. And to give us the US perspective, we have Ms. Yuki Tatsumi, who is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Before joining the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., Yuki worked as the research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and she has also worked as an assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us again. I like to just start off with a sort of a broad stepping back and looking at the issues in the Indo-Pacific and surrounding the diplomacy. Of course, Indo-Pacific has become all of the rage. Every testimony in Congress we hear, we talk about the Indo-Pacific. And I think the Quad uh, congregation first started back in the early 2000s as a result of a dawning realization of this concept of Indo-Pacific. So I think I like to start off by just asking everybody to give us your impressions so far of kind of the Biden administration's picking up from the Trump administration this Indo-Pacific strategy and its efforts in diplomacy on the Indo-Pacific in the region. Of course, as we mentioned, we've had the Quad Summit, but we've also had secretaries of state and defense traveling out to Japan, to the region, putting out joint statements. And of course, we've had the Indo-Pacific invoked in the recent meeting between the US and China in Alaska. We know that Tony Blinken is going this week to Brussels, to the NATO summit, and to meet with the EU, which is also actually about to put out its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So maybe I'll start with you, Yuki. If you could just sort of give some reflections on, how this approach to the US to the Indo-Pacific, how do you think it's going so far, and how do you see it going in the future?
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, National Committee on American Foreign Policy, for having me this evening. And it's so good to see Hosoya-san and Jaruva, and I read Rory's work for a long time, so great honor to be amongst you all. So in answer to your question, Susan, I think my initial sense is that Biden administration is really trying to walk the talk as they first start out the first month of his presidency. The President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken and also SecDef Austin down on all have sent a very coherent message that this administration will repair alliances and repair partnership that may have been damaged for the last several years with the previous administration's unilateralism and a very high-handed and sometimes a transactional approach to alliances and partnerships. And we will respond to the whole variety of challenges that are posed by China from the position of strength. And then I think it is really remarkable that for us first overseas trip that the Secretary of State and Defense, two cabinet ministers actually took this trip together. For those of us who have been in the government service, we all appreciate the hassle and difficulty of coordinating all these different cabinet members' calendar to get this 2+2 going in the first place. And it is really remarkable that this administration chose Japan and South Korea for these joint overseas in person. And this is also remarkable too in the age of COVID, for this to basically pick these pick these two allies for their destination. And then I think it is also very important to note that, like you said, Susan, that Tony Blinken is going off to Brussels. And that is the first step to repair the NATO side of the alliance relationship. And this is really coming in confluence of events that the major NATO countries like France and Germany and UK has really increasing their attention to the developments in the Indo-Pacific and how Chinese assertive behavior is really impacting their side of the globe too, as a general challenge to the liberal international order. So I really think it's remarkable. I think really this administration so far has been investing a lot of time, a lot of senior cabinet members' attention to walk the talk of the repairing alliances and facing China from the position of strength.
Okay, thanks so much, Yuki. And I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think that certainly is the intention. So I'd love to hear, though, from our guests representing other countries who have been on sort of the receiving end of this disciplined message that you mentioned and this kind of flurry of diplomacy. So why don't we go, Rory, first to you, and then to Hosoya-san, and then to Dhruva, to just give your general impressions on how you think this is going. Rory?
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be here. I think the last time I engaged with this organisation was a number of years ago, when it still wasn't clear whether the United States would comprehensively turn to the Indo-Pacific. And I think what we're seeing now very clearly is not only continuity from the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy to a Biden Indo-Pacific strategy, but actually frankly, an improvement, a refinement, an enhancement of the competitive edges of what the Trump administration began to realise was necessary with regard to China, and now applying that much more clearly in comprehensive engagement with allies and partners, but as we've seen in Anchorage, holding a very firm line on China. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think the Biden administration has got off to a strong start in the Indo-Pacific. There actually has been a lot of thinking behind this. If you look at a lot of the reports coming out of US think tanks, the big congressionally mandated report that Eli Ratner led a year or two ago, there's been a lot of time to shape this thinking, the work that Kurt Campbell and others have done in the second track. And now the administration is hitting the ground running. So that's the good news. It's welcome from Australia's perspective, I think, and I think importantly, it's going to be in sync with the expectations of allies and partners who want the US in the Indo-Pacific. If America had suddenly reverted to a narrower Asia-Pacific vision that sort of shut out the Indian Ocean or India, it would be unilateralist and anachronistic. It's out of step with the rest of us. The hard work, though, lies ahead. And I think one of the questions I'd love to explore in this session is whether, in fact, all of that promise of the Quad that we've heard lately, which I think is a big talk and it's serious, the commitment to competitive coexistence that we've seen in Anchorage, and the commitment to really engaging with this huge range of Indo-Pacific partners, can all this be sustained while the United States is rebuilding at home? Thank you.
Great, very good points, and we're definitely going to plan to get into some of that. Professor Hosoya.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, for your very kind introduction. And I'm particularly glad to be here as a part of the great project on the Quad, among the Quad, at the historic moment. I said this is really historic as the Declaration of the United Nations of January 1942 by the four signatories, United States, UK, and China, and the Soviet Union. Of course, now we are different four parts, but anyway, I think that it's really historic to see this new gathering of the summit. I have two particular impressions after the summit meeting recently. One impression is that I think that we are seeing return of diplomacy, or return of professional diplomacy. And I think that the current Biden administration has a very strong team in promoting its own Indo-Pacific strategy. And it's good to see the return of professional diplomacy because it's much more predictable. And also it doesn't necessarily offend. I mean, the current US administration is trying to not to offend China unnecessarily. So in many ways, I think that that the current diplomacy of the Biden administration is really professional. My second impression is, at the same time, I think that it's really good thing for the Biden administration not to abandon some of the good parts of the previous administration. It's often the case that the new administration easily tends to abandon some of the good parts of the previous administration to try to present some fresh impression to voters. But I think that the Biden administration is professional enough not to abandon some of the very good results of the previous administration, such as its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So in these senses, I think that I'm really glad to see the current development in foreign policy of the Biden administration.
Great, thank you so much. And that's a good point, that the Biden team has really I think, picked up the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. They're making some adjustments, as Rory also mentioned, and are continuing with it. I think they did put out their interim national security guidance, which is sort of a placeholder for their own national security strategy. So we will see. Still, we don't have a fully formed strategy yet, right? We're waiting to see what the national security strategy will bring. But Dhruva, over to you for your impressions of just how it's going.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And thanks to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and to you, Ambassador Thornton and Ambassador Elliott as well for having me as part of this distinguished panel. In some ways, India is a bit of an outlier amongst the 4 Quad countries. It's the only one that is not a formal US treaty ally, unlike Japan and Australia. And in some ways, the hardest part of Quad coordination, to date and perhaps even going forward, is incorporating India into these habits of cooperation that have become very well developed between the United States and Japan and the United States and Australia, two of its key allies in the Indo-Pacific. In some ways, this summit that we just held, and I do agree, I think it's quite a significant step. We can see it in sort of 2 ways. I think it's sort of interesting to look at it. One is if the rise of China is the cardinal geopolitical event of the 21st century to date, this is in some ways the most significant response, if you will, geopolitical response to that development. And in that sense, it's significant in and of itself. The second is it's in some ways a continuation or an elevation of a trend that we have seen really over the last 20 years. And I would sort of go back to the years of 1999 and 2000, when India was actually in 1999 subject to sanctions by much of the rest of the world for its nuclear program. And very soon after that, in 99, 2000, we saw the visits of 3 leaders, that is Bill Clinton to India, followed soon after by Prime Minister Modi from Japan and Prime Minister John Howard from Australia. And that in some ways started a process that continued over the next 20 years and culminated in India forging much closer ties with those 3 countries. And of course, ultimately ending up in the Quad. And so it's in some ways a natural conclusion to see this emerge as a summit. In terms of the summit itself, I think there are 3 big takeaways from it. One is, as the other speakers have said, underscoring the importance and the priority that the 4 countries now accord the Quad. That this happened so soon in the new administration, within 2 months, is really quite significant. And it's been followed up by a visit just over the weekend by Secretary of Defense Austin to India on his first trip to Asia, along with Japan and South Korea, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan saying very clearly that one of the things, he mentioned 2 things that the Biden administration would take forward from the Trump administration, the Quad being one of them, the Abraham Accords being the other. And so I think all of this is a very clear signal of the priority accorded to the Quad by the 4 countries. The second, I think, big significance is the Quad laying out a positive vision. I think there are a lot of question marks about what does the Quad stand for? Is it just about balancing China? And I think what quite clearly came out of this is there is a positive and affirmative vision that the Quad countries have. The centerpiece, of course, is the vaccine production and distribution effort that will be underway. But equally, it sort of translates into other areas, including the 3 working groups that I know we'll discuss. But going beyond that in the security domain, in terms of disaster relief, cyber, and a whole range of areas. And finally, I think the third sort of big significance is on the implementation side. There were a lot of question marks as to, there was no joint statement of the Quad prior. There was no secretariat. What is it actually doing apart from a sort of a meeting of the minds at the senior political levels? And I think what they've done quite creatively is create these working groups that thread the needle between being an overly bureaucratic sort of secretariat-driven organization, and on the other hand, a very loose, informal coordination mechanism. So I think those are the 3 big takeaways for me from the summit.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail right on the head, that there are these sort of dualities about the Quad in a way. You have the 3, and we used to always have a trilateral meeting when we gathered for ASEAN between the US, Japan, and Australia, and it was pretty seamless and there were pretty wide-ranging cooperation. And then we would bring India in for the Quad, which was kind of a different kind of a conversation. I think it's definitely the case that now we've moved to a new level. I appreciate Professor Hosoya's talking about it as the sort of rebirth of the United Nations. And I heard the Australian Prime Minister, I think, also was waxing quite enthusiastic about it. So I guess I like to come back to you, Rory, because you indicated an interest in getting into some of the details. And I think the thing that I'm most wondering about coming off of the summit is that the Quad has always had this undercurrent of being this kind of counterbalancing group of 4 democracies in Asia that could be a counterweight to the rise of China and any threats or challenges posed by China. But I think what we saw from the summit, and I'd be curious if you agree, is that we can't just have that as the sole raison d'etre for this grouping. There has to be an affirmative program of why these 4 countries in particular are coming together and what can they do together. And I've always kind of, I think Dhruva also hinted at this, seen this project as a part of, the activation of India in the region. For me, that's always been at least a kind of a hidden agenda that I had when I was working on these issues. I don't know how India sees it. Sometimes they seem more enthusiastic, sometimes less. But I'd wonder how you sort of see those 2 aspects of the Quad and how you think they'll go forward.
Well, thanks, Susan. And look, I've certainly tracked the history of the Quad right from its inception. Indeed, I guess I'm guilty of being one of those analysts who, before the Quad even was a thing in 2007, was I guess, drawing the impression that it would be a good idea. So it's fantastic to see it evolve. But we have to remember that, as we know, it began with disaster relief. It began with providing a collective good to the people of the Indo-Pacific, to the people of Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular, after the tsunami in 2004. So in a way, the much more constructive, engagement-focused, collaborative agenda that the Quad Summit has just unveiled, COVID, climate, technology, this is actually almost returning to its roots. It's the Quad being true to its origins, while at the same time coming to terms with the fact that this is now a region of strategic competition. And so I am comfortable for the time being with the Quad being this, as you say, having a duality, being a hybrid creature, that it is both a balancing mechanism and an engagement mechanism at the same time. And the proof of that, for me, lies in the fact that attitudes are changing to the Quad. Not only are Quad skeptics in Quad countries beginning to say, well, hang on, this isn't just, Trump era theatrics. This is actually 4 very substantial countries joining forces across a whole range of issues. There's also the new context where I think we're all worried about what Chinese assertiveness and Chinese unilateralism means. So I'm reasonably hopeful about where the Quad will go now. I'm not quite ready to say that this is, as important as the birth of the UN or NATO or ANZUS or some other much more formal arrangement, but it is historic. And it's clearly not just the chemistry of these 4 leaders at this time. I might just elaborate on 2 points, if I may, before we go back, and that is about a forward-leaning agenda, because I think that, that there are several, minimums that we need to see from the Quad over the next year or 2 to stay on this path. And firstly, the Quad's got to keep up the momentum of meeting, of engaging. Now the leaders have committed to meeting again. There's foreign ministers, there's officials. Increasingly, there'll be informal military engagement. That momentum, I think, will stay. Secondly, there's a practical work plan now. COVID, obviously the big vaccine program, which is really at least over the next 2 years. It's going to take time and require sustained effort, but that is potentially a game changer for the Quad and for balancing Chinese influence. Thirdly, these working groups on critical technology and climate. And interestingly, the Quad could actually help not only counter, if you like, Chinese influence in the region, but it may also improve, get all 4 Quad partners to lift their own game, because the Quad will in fact be a mechanism to encourage Australia to be a little more progressive on climate, I think. over time as well. And on critical tech, finally, and I'll conclude on that point for the moment, my own institution, the National Security College at the Australian National University, has for some months now been preparing a program of potential work for the Quad on critical tech. So we actually have some nicely timed publications that are things we prepared earlier, because there is a program of work here. If you look at the potential of these four countries in innovation, in human capital, in their attitude to internet governance and to standards in tech, there's an enormous amount of untapped potential there, a lot of hard work, but I think now the game is on.
Great, that's very, very helpful. And to draw out all of those details about the various working groups, I think that gives us a rich field to mine here. So maybe Yuki, can I come back to you? I guess, let's continue with this question about sort of the takeaways from the Quad and how we can sustain it going forward. I was very happy to hear Rory mention public goods and the provision of public goods, because this has been an issue, of course, under the Trump administration and for the US in the region, given the difficulties we've had in some sense in coming up with an economic agenda for the last few years in the region. And so this provision of public goods, I think the Quad could be very helpful in that. And it's really great that we saw this first initiative being rolled out in that sphere. So what is your thought on sort of the work program going forward and how to balance that with the countering China angle?
I think that is a great question, because whether it's Quad or US-Japan-Australia trilateral or US-Japan-India trilateral, I think that balancing has been the most difficult aspect of these cooperations. That these three countries, three or four countries, definitely share the concerns on this providing public goods, upholding certain international norms, and I think these three working groups are very good place to start, in the sense that with the exception of a technology aspect of a technology working group, remaining two are truly public goods, very apolitical. It's much less controversial as opposed to working group on, let's say, maritime safety, for example. But when it comes to technology, I think I would also like to explore my co-panelist thoughts on this, is that this has been a problem for US allies and partners in the region during the Trump administration, because some of the policy that the Trump administration set in terms of export control guidelines and some of the screenings and supply chain related initiatives are really putting many of our allies and partners in the region, who has a very complex economic relationship with China, in a very tough spot, because they're really forcing our friends and allies to the place where they say it's either with us or against us, and you have to make a decision, and we're really not going to give you too much time to decide. And then I think Biden administration is taking much more nuanced way. And I would actually highlight what Secretary of State Blinken talked about when he went on the record interview while he stayed in Tokyo, when asked by interviewer about Japanese complex economic relationship with China. And so far, Japan has not been able to decouple from China. And at what point US consider that as a problem? And Secretary Blinken really couched it in a way that, look, this is really not for or against someone or some other country. It is really about joining forces to stand up to our values that we all believe in. And we all have complex relationship with China. Relationship with China has a very complex aspect of it. Some are confrontational, some are competitive, but some could be cooperative. So I think this administration is right in the way that picking the areas that are comfortable for the all four countries to start a conversation about cooperating. But I think I would really be curious to see how this technology working group, the conversation will evolve, because this will inevitably comes to the point where the talks about technology transfer, how to protect the abuse, how to protect the digital and some like 5G and other advanced technologies from being abused by authoritarian states. So that conversation's evolution could start breaching into some of those sensitive area where divergence among these four countries could start to unravel. But I think for now, these three working groups are a really good place to start, I would say.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you mentioned that especially the first two working groups on COVID vaccines and on health cooperation, and then the climate change group are non-controversial. Those are clear global achievements, targets that we want to hit. It's interesting that you bring up the values aspect, because that is actually, it is a bit complicated, right? I got this question over the weekend from a reporter, about sort of how do we see, because originally, and even in Admiral Davidson's recent testimony, this Quad grouping is billed as a so-called diamond of democracies, and it certainly is. But on the values agenda, which certainly Secretary of State Blinken has been highlighting, it can get a little bit more complicated. I think on technology, it can also get a little bit more complicated. First of all, the US hasn't gotten too far down the road in what kind of technology standards and regulations it wants to see at home, never mind roll out to other partners like Quad partners. So some of these, and I think India has different views on some of these things, even from some of the prevailing, at least, thoughts that have been characterizing the US administration. So I think some of these things could, as you say, become more complicated. But I'd love to hear, Dhruva, what your thinking is on these issues about sort of how realistic is it to expect that we can, as you said, develop these habits of cooperation? Because I do really think that's at the heart of this. I think bringing India into those habits is really a big part of the agenda that we want to see, not just on the security side, which we want to see too, but also in some of these other public goods provision areas.
Sure. No, I mean, I think a few thoughts on that. I think the key thing, when you talk about the values agenda, I think the key thing, if you see the joint statements that have come out and the op-ed written by the four leaders that was published in the Washington Post, the thread is really about respect for a rules-based international order and sort of respect for international law. And I think that is really, what in some ways brings the four countries together more than anything else, is broad agreement about what constitutes major transgressions of that of that rules-based international order, and what characteristics and what policies can help uphold or shore up that international order. That brings me to sort of, I think, one immediate test case of that to some degree has been Myanmar, where in some, again, all four countries, although with different emphases and with very different interests, have been reasonably unified in calling for a return to democracy in Myanmar at some point in the future. Obviously, a country like India has very different stakes and interests in Myanmar, including counterterrorism cooperation with the military there. But that hasn't prevented India from voicing consistent calls for a return of democracy to Myanmar, and I suspect we'll see similar similar coordination in other places as well. Finally, I think while it's good that there is this sort of positive and widening agenda when it comes to issues like public health and climate change, we shouldn't lose sight of, in some ways, what has been the driving force of quadrilateral cooperation, which is, in large part, security issues as well, and which Rory, amongst others, has articulated, including in his book, which I would highly recommend to those of you. He might be too modest to speak of it himself. But ultimately, I think it will come. A lot of it will come down to security cooperation as well going forward, and moving beyond the basic coordination, which has grown in leaps and bounds and is continuing to take place, where there's a lot more work to be done, to actual cooperation in terms of the four parties helping each other with their own security, building up their own capacity, leveraging their relative strengths, and ultimately to sort of moving towards more distribution of labor in terms of securing the Indo-Pacific, the commons in the Indo-Pacific. So I just think it's all this talk, and all of this needs to be done in terms of creating this positive vision in terms of public goods. We shouldn't lose sight of some of the other items that ought to be high up on the agenda.
Well, thank you so much for bringing up what I think is going to be a pretty hard question, and I'll throw this to you, Professor Hosoya, which is the question of what can the four countries really do to enforce the international rules-based system in the Indo-Pacific in the face of China's rise. And I just want to point to today, actually, there was another example, which was the US, the UK, Canada, and the EU jointly announcing sanctions against Chinese officials in Xinjiang for the atrocities in Xinjiang, and adding, I mean, the US has already announced a number of sanctions, but this was a joint announcement by those four in an effort, again, to try to do this, to hold China accountable in the international rules-based system. But obviously it's very difficult. And I hazard to predict that this joint sanctions effort is probably not going to have the desired effect. So when the four countries of the Quad sit down together and try to think about how to discipline China, can you paint a picture for us of how you think that, what is it that we can do, and how you think that will look?
Yeah, thank you very much. As we discussed, there are 3 working groups. And nowadays, I think that economic issues or business issues are quite closely tied with security or political issues. And China often weaponized vaccine or technology, high technology, or trade issues like Australian wine to try to pressure any one country not to criticize China or not to take one action, which China doesn't like to see. So I think that the framework for the Quad is a very good tool to warn China not to do that by helping each other based upon trust. So I think that one of the biggest strengths of the Quad is that we can show to international communities that international cooperation can be deeper if we can have trust, mutual trust, or if we respect each other. And I think that this should be the foundation of international cooperation. On the other hand, as I said, China often tried to weaponize some of the economic issues or technological issues to force the third country. And I think that this is a really, really bad trend. And one country is weak. So I think that the Quad is showing that the Quad that doesn't actually leave any one country alone in this kind of a confrontation with China. So in this sense, I think that now Australians or Australian government can have much stronger assurance of not being alone in legitimately criticize some of the policies which China is showing.
So I think that's a great answer. We can try to sort of have a united front that doesn't leave countries out. And I'd love to hear how people think that is going to go. So I don't know, Rory, do you have any additional thoughts on this, sort of also on the security side, right? Not just the economic and this kind of sanctions front, but really on the security side is something that I think we've had a kind of a difficult time to try to push back against some of these transgressions. Welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thanks, Susan. I think that we do have to be realistic about the pace and the limitations of security cooperation among the Quad members in any sort of hard security sense. We've got actually rapid improvement in those relationships over the years, bilaterally and trilaterally. The Australia-India security mil-mil relationship is a real thing now. We do a lot of high-end exercises together, trilateral security relationships, obviously the various US alliances in the system. But critics of the Quad still come back to this very simple question, well, is the Quad really going to rally as an alliance in a major security contingency over Taiwan or whatever it might be? And I think the short-term answer is no. I don't think that's what we're talking about. In the future, who knows? I mean, I think in many ways, it is China that's driven the Quad. It is China coercing individual countries, raising anxieties. I think it is China that, in my view, pushed India literally over the line in the last few years to a much more forthright defence of, not defence, but advocacy of the Quad. But that does not mean that Dhruva, I'm speaking for India here. I don't know if I've got this right or not, but I don't think that means that officials are sitting in the Indian Foreign Ministry or Defence Ministry watching the situation on the border with China and the violence that we've seen in the last year and thinking, when are the Quad cavalry going to arrive? That's not how it works, but it's much more about nations taking their own stand for their own interests, burden sharing, and finding all sorts of practical ways to keep bolstering each other now. There will be, I think, intelligence sharing among Quad countries, logistics, training, and who knows how they'll look at contingencies into the future. And I kind of think that's enough. I'll just touch on the economic point before I wrap up there. And I will say, and thanks Dhruva for mentioning my book on the Indo-Pacific, which does try to track the strategic contest that is emerging and the evolution of the Quad, the history of the Quad, incidentally, across 4 dimensions. The security, the geoeconomic, the diplomatic, and really the narrative battle, the information warfare. And it's happening on all of these fronts now. I think in many ways, the Quad in the medium term is going to be more useful in a lot of these non-military areas, precisely because it is a way of demonstrating to China that it's not simply some, alleged Anglo-Saxon club of the Five Eyes that rallies on issues like critical technology and espionage and interference and supply chains, but that with Japan and India and potentially others coming into that arrangement, there's going to be an authentically Indo-Pacific set of alternatives, not containment or decoupling, but a set of alternatives on supply chain and economic issues. And this will, I think, over time, help us build the economic diversification that we need. Thank you.
Great. I don't know, Dhruva, if you want to come in here, but I just wanted to ask a question before we go to our audience's questions for the group about the sort of Quad and the deepening and strengthening of the international rules-based system, if you will. And in a couple of our other sessions that we've held with Indo-Pacific partners, this issue has come up about the tension between sort of major power competition and the strengthening of the rules-based order and the ability to constrain countries to keep to and adhere to the rules-based system. And I don't know how you see the Quad in that context, but do you think the Quad has a role to play in also constraining and sort of modeling adherence to the rules-based system? And is that also a potential, highlight for the Quad to push forward?
So, I mean, I think that's in some ways a sort of a key question, and to sort of use what sort of Roy said and others, I think a few things to be kept in mind. I think one is it's not very helpful to think of the Quad as a sort of exclusive mutual commitment to defense. And I don't think that's going to happen in the near future for a variety of reasons. Even during the Cold War, it was very difficult to get a sort of collective security type of arrangement in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, and it's going to be even more difficult today. It is, however, a mechanism for burden sharing, and I think in some ways it will help the 4 participant countries to focus more on their core competencies and their core geographies. So I think that's a much more helpful way of thinking about it. When it comes to the rules-based order, again, I would say that this is a mechanism that helps uphold it precisely by giving countries more options. In fact, preserving their ability to choose. Again, a lot of the complaints that you hear, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in other countries, is that the growing tensions between China on the one hand and the Quad countries on the other is actually diminishing the room for choice. And I think that that's in some ways not a very accurate way of thinking about it. When it comes to competition and cooperation, I mean, I think the reality is we are living in a competitive, competitive world, and that's not going to change. That's been true since time immemorial. The question is, are there ways of cooperating to ensure that strong international system that requires this of reinforcing of values and reinforcement of a rules-based order? Is that possible at all? And I think this is where, if you look at the, individually, obviously each of the Quad countries is beset with problems, has its own challenges of various kinds. But collectively, the Quad countries, if you take almost any dimension, from military spending to R&D to demographics to power projection, maritime power, collectively their strengths actually dwarf China's on many fronts. So I do think that, again, this is a form of cooperation that can ensure that in a more competitive atmosphere that we are witnessing, that you can still have an attempt at reinforcing a rules-based order.
Let me come to you, Yuki, for chiming in on this kind of round of questions. If you have any thoughts on this issue of sort of balance of power in the region, can the Quad balance China? Where will that leave other countries in the region? And how do you see that sort of working as a vis-a-vis the international system and its deepening and strengthening?
Thanks, Suzanne. I think especially in the areas of issues such as climate change, which is more of a positive, non-political, relatively politically sensitive, less politically sensitive area, I do think that cooperation and policy coordination amongst the Quad country could set a group positive examples to the rest of the world. And then also Quad can be a base to reach out to other allies and partners across the globe that are not formally included in this grouping, such as South Korea comes to my mind at the top of my head. And then also, as Secretary Blinken travels to NATO, European would be a very important partner, especially on the issues like virus, vaccines, and climate change. One thing I would like to highlight, I don't mean to throw in monkey wrenches here in this a flow of the discussion, but one thing that could complicate even what we initially thinks non-political, no-brainer cooperation in cooperative area is how Quad countries each sees Taiwan. That especially in the public health realm, whether and to what degree involve Taiwan into this discussion of sharing good practices, and how each of the Quad countries sees that could actually complicate the conversation amongst the 4 and others, frankly. But other than that, I do think that Quad grouping does have a potential to put the set the examples for the rest of the countries in the region.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. Thanks so much to all of you. And I do want to get, we have a few questions in from our pretty extensive audience tonight. This topic of the Quad was very popular among our members and among a lot of people who are coming in from around the world. So I want to give a chance to ask some of these questions. And Yuki, I'm glad that you mentioned other countries that might want to be involved as partners for the Quad, because we have quite a few questions involving exactly that. So I believe that Boris Johnson has already mentioned that he'd like for the UK to be, I don't know if you call it a Quad observer or honorary member or partner, but anyway, that would be another one that has already been mooted. And you mentioned, I think, South Korea, whether or not they would want to join, whether or not they would bring any kind of synergies to the grouping. So I guess, and then there's a question that sort of related, which is that, does the Quad really have any overlapping kind of vital interests other than just balancing China? So I think we've been speaking a little bit to that one, but it's more directly pointed at the nature of this kind of 4-country grouping. What's so special about these 4 countries? We've touched on that, but I think getting to the point of, how do other countries figure in the Quad? There's also been a question, I suppose, of ASEAN's relationship to the Quad. And I think the Biden administration has actually been having a bit of a kind of tussle over this, because they keep mentioning ASEAN centrality in almost every single announcement and paper that they have, where they also mention the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. So, ASEAN's been quite sensitive. They do have their own now Indo-Pacific outlook strategy, so they have adopted it. But if you could all just take a shot at that, sort of other countries relating to the Quad, how is it useful? Is it too nascent? Will bringing in more countries just hasten the complicated nature, et cetera? So maybe, Rory, why don't we come to you, since you're the author of the book?
Look, thanks, Susan. And look, what I'll share the book here with your viewers.
There we
just
go.
so that we know what we're talking about. So Indo-Pacific Empire is the name of the book, and there's a bit of ambiguity about which empire we're talking about.
I was going to ask you, but good.
Well, it does allude a little bit to some of the quasi colonialist characteristics of the Belt and Road. I won't say more than that. But look, quite seriously, the question of where the Quad fits into the multi-layered diplomatic architecture of the Indo-Pacific is a key question. That's actually something I try to address in the book, because the Quad is not the solution to all our problems, and it doesn't pretend to be. I think it's really important, though, that it's now being increasingly accepted. If you look at opinion polling among Southeast Asian elites, if you as we've heard in the conversation today, if you look particularly at analysts who are really interested in the public goods challenge in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad is now, I think, meeting all of those audiences with a much more open mind. And I think the way forward on this is that we will see a whole lot of flexible Quad plus arrangements. We've already seen one. For example, last year there was a series of dialogues on pandemic response among the Quad countries with officials from New Zealand, I think South Korea, and if I'm not mistaken, Vietnam. So that was very much based on interest and competence, if you like, rather than any kind of necessarily ideological vision. We will see, I think, Quad engagement with European partners. The Quad navies, as it happens, are going to be exercising with the French in the Bay of Bengal pretty soon, as I understand it. It won't be flagged as Quad Plus or Malabar Plus, but it's the same thing by another means. There is the British interest, and South Korean as well, which I think would be really important to help Seoul look beyond its peninsular horizons to the fact that the ROK actually is an Indo-Pacific country with deep interests across the sea lanes. The two critical questions there are ASEAN and Taiwan. And I think with regard to ASEAN, the Quad statement has respected ASEAN centrality, which is a line you don't tend to get in Belt and Road announcements. So I think in a sense already the Quad is trying to win back, I think, an inclusive relationship with ASEAN, and it could well be that in a lot of the ASEAN-centric regional architecture, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, which are actually Indo-Pacific bodies, effectively, the Quad could become something of a caucus or a rallying group that will work with and encourage more purposeful action, either by individual or collective ASEAN countries on the issues that affect the region. So I think that's not insurmountable at all. I think Taiwan obviously is a big question for every country. And I think here, if I can use the term, the spirit of the Quad, which has been used in the announcement, I think the spirit of the Quad is about an inclusive approach to regional security. It's not just the military dimension. It looks at public health, where Taiwan has absolutely excelled. It looks at supply chains and critical technologies, where Taiwan actually is an integral part of the Indo-Pacific and global economy. And so I would say over time, the Quad will have to come to terms with the Taiwan issue. It will have to look at ways in which it can discourage together Chinese coercion against Taiwan, much of that coercion being short of military thresholds. And I don't think this means Quad countries have to reach a formal agreement on their relations with Taiwan or Taiwan's status in the international system. It's partly simply a recognition that Taiwan is critical to the regional economy, and that the democratic values of the Taiwanese people do have a consonance with the rules-based order that the Quad seeks to preserve.
Okay, that gets us pretty far along to answering some of these questions. I wonder, there is a question here about sort of China's reaction to all of this. And I wonder if we could sort of touch on that lightly, because, you know, everything should be sweetness and light, and this should all go along swimmingly, and we should all come to cooperation, and we should all find ways to enforce the rules-based order. But there are probably some downside risks. And I wonder if, Professor Hosoya, if you might, you know, talk about what are some things that could go wrong here?
Right. I have a sense that if the Quad is trying to contain China, we will fail, because other countries like ASEAN or Europe, or of course Russia and South Korea as well, they don't like to see that this powerful Quad is trying to contain China. Of course, Japan, the biggest trading partner is China. That's why we cannot do it, of course. We have a supply chain in East Asia together with South Korea or China and so on. And also, it is important to notice that while the BRICS is a kind of a community of interest, but on the other hand, the Quad is a community of values or norms. We share basic values. So it is natural to assume that China cannot share some of the values of which the four parts in the document, joint statement, presented in its documents. So in that sense, I think that it is a little bit complicated, because it's a kind of a community of idea or value. That's why it would be natural to see that China feel quite uncomfortable about this form of group of countries. But on the other hand, I think that China doesn't deny the existence of competition. Of course, like Ambassador Fu Ying repeatedly mentioned about the existence of both competition and cooperation. That's why there exists a side of this kind of a competition between China and liberal democracies. And China is saying, the Chinese government is saying that China is winning this ideological confrontation against liberal democracies, particularly at the time of the COVID-19. But the other thing is that we are not at war with China. We are now at war with COVID-19. So in this fight, I think that China can contribute and cooperate with, of course, Quad or any other kind of groupings. In that sense, I think that it is important to assume that. And also, Foreign Minister Motegi, Toshimitsu Motegi, recently mentioned about the Quad Plus. He said that the Quad should work with ASEAN, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I think that in the last 2 or 3 decades, Japanese regional vision for regional grouping is always inclusive. So in the sense, I think that the Japanese government is willing to form quite inclusive regional framework, either with China or not with China.
I think now we know why you mentioned this 4-party summit as being the sort of most important thing since the signing of the UN 4-power agreement, because it's going to involve the entire world, just like the UN, according to Foreign Minister Motegi, or it could possibly, I guess. So I see now where that's coming from. Thank you very much for those comments. I think that's very important addition, and I'm glad that you were so frank and honest in your response. We have a bunch of other questions. One comes from one of our terrific young Korean emerging leaders, Boram Kwan, who asks, how much time will it take to find the optimal agenda for the Quad, not just narrowly economic, but also security related? What is a realistic timeline now that we've had the first leaders level meeting? What is a realistic timeline to see the Quad sort of evolve and bloom in its full potential? So Dhruva, you can take that one, or any of the other comments that that you want to pick up on here. Please, over to you.
Thank you. So actually, it relates to some of the other things I wanted to just mention from some of the previous questions as well. You know, I think that the big story on security cooperation is a lot of that has been developed over the last 20 years, quite slowly, often on a bilateral or a trilateral basis. And if you look at every one of the 6 constituent bilateral relationships of the Quad, that is all you've seen progress on each one of those dyads over the past few years. And I'll just give a few examples. I mean, you know, Japan and India have done their first military Army and Air Force exercises in the last few years together. They send observers to their exercises elsewhere. India-Australia naval cooperation in particular has gone ahead every 2 years now, 2015, 2017, 2019. We've seen significant maritime exercises between India and Australia. Japan and Australia have been negotiating and expect to soon conclude an agreement that is akin to a status of forces agreement, subject to approvals now. So I think if you look at any bilateral relationship, the security cooperation has grown. I just want to make a couple of points on the questions that have come up, and several questions have come up to this extent, on the exclusivity of the Quad. And just to elaborate a bit more detail on what Rory said, let's take security cooperation. In 2007, the Quad did a naval exercise with Singapore, the Malabar 0702 exercise. Just a few weeks ago, the 4 countries plus Canada, and I know we had one participant ask a question from Canada, did an anti-submarine warfare exercise in Guam, involving P-8 or similar aircraft from all 4 countries plus Canada. With the 4 countries are doing, as Rory mentioned, exercise with France in the Bay of Bengal soon. So that's on the security side. On the public health side, we've seen a COVID contact group that was created, which was the Quad plus 3 others. And this gets into another question that was asked, which is Vietnam's inclusion was as the chair of ASEAN for last year. So New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam were added. Separately, there was a foreign ministers dialogue that emerged last year that included all 4 Quad countries plus Brazil, Israel, and South Korea. So again, 3 other significant democracies. If you look at on the technology side, I mean, again, a key UK-led initiative has been the D10, which is the G7 plus South Korea, Australia, and India that now encompasses all 4 Quad countries to cooperate on, amongst other things, 5G specifically. And then, you know, you see the Quad countries all represented at other major forums. One very new and interesting one has been a global partnership on artificial intelligence, which is housed at the OECD in Paris. It started up recently, but it's a largely Franco-Canadian-led initiative that now all 4 Quad countries are founding members of. So again, you see in emerging technologies on COVID, on security, you have seen the Quad countries take a very inclusive approach to including other countries. insofar as there is will and capability on the part of those partner countries to contribute. I'll just end on one note, which is I think on the security side, and that's the issues I sort of pay most attention to. I would say two key partner countries going forward. One will be France, which has major assets and capabilities in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. But another one that hasn't been mentioned so far really, I think, will be Indonesia going forward. And that is, if you just look at the geography, the weight, and Indonesia will be a key partner to engage for the Quad countries, and has been a leader in some ways in advancing the Indo-Pacific outlook within ASEAN as well. And then just a final point on that, related again to a question that was asked. There are a lot of concerns I hear repeatedly in ASEAN, amongst the Southeast Asian countries, about the Quad and even Quad plus grouping somehow undermining the centrality of ASEAN. But I think it's a very selective reading of what's going on, because the Southeast Asian countries have not raised a fuss about many other groupings that some of their member states have been a part of, not least, the Five Powers Defense Arrangement, TPP, BIMSTEC, which includes Thailand and Myanmar, and a whole range of other groupings. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem if individual member states of ASEAN do work with the Quad countries on specific initiatives in the year forward. I don't see it as, I don't think it should be portrayed accurately as undermining ASEAN unity and centrality, as some of the skeptics do seem to allege.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That was Jonathan Stromseth's question about incorporating ASEAN into, and incorporating the Quad into ASEAN. You mentioned that, of course, with the D10, all 4 Quad countries are members, but I think all 4 Quad member countries are also members of the East Asia Summit. I want to go to Yuki because she had some comments she wanted to make on this area, but one other thing that's sort of looming out there is this question of architecture. And Yuki, you mentioned in your original comments of the night how difficult it is to get a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense to go to a region at the same time. I was looking at that summit, Hollywood Square's Zoom meeting with the 4 presidents there, and I was thinking about how great it is that we now have the virtual space, and how difficult it would be to actually engineer that outside of a major multilateral meeting. And it gets to this question of architecture, and the US hasn't had a great record of showing up at a lot of these things over the years. So I just want to raise that to see if anyone has any thoughts about sort of the, I think this is a trend that we're seeing, which is the plurilateralization of the multilateral system, where we have, combinations of countries that can get things done and have overlapping interests, and then they bring them maybe into the multilateral system or into the EAS or somewhere else. But it's also, we have to not forget, and we have a few former diplomats here, how difficult it is with limited time of principles to make these things actually work well. So Yuki, over to you.
Yes, and not alone. All of the times that we all need to be spending to draft, coordinate the talking points from each other on the layers and layers of unilaterals. So I think, if anything, those how much of the work that that needs to go involved might actually present the most practical challenge of moving these multi-layered multilateral approach toward the regional architecture moving forward. But in terms of the issue that Daruba mentioned, which is the ASEAN's seeming ambivalence about the Quad and its relationship, and some of the skeptics' view on the how it might be seen as the undermining as in ASEAN centrality and unity. I think there is also a question constantly posited at ASEAN about what has ASEAN centrality and unity has achieved. And we've often talked about, depending on who has the chair of the ASEAN, the ASEAN's position as a grouping on different areas used to waver quite a lot. And nowadays, I think we are seeing less and less of that. And thus, I think it does create open up more room for Quad-like grouping and ASEAN as another grouping to have a more forward-leaning and specific policy conversations. But that is a challenge, that when you put together one multilateral grouping with the other multilateral groupings, and we are, if you're looking at the beyond the Indo-Pacific region, we have multiple of those. And I think one of my co-panelists, I think it was Daruva, but perhaps Rory also did that too, that any country who shares the values and who has the will and who has a capacity to contribute to this kind of a grouping should be able to participate and are welcome to participate from a Quad's perspective, quite honestly. But at the same time, the flip side of the coin is what happens when those different countries, even if they are perfectly capable of contributing, may have different ideas about how things are going. And then I think South Korea, unfortunately, has been the, under any normal circumstances, South Korea is a no-brainer partner. But because of the current administration's very specific focus on reconciliation with North Korea, and its very difficult, challenging relationship that it's been having with China, making South Korea very difficult to participate, even if there is a will. So I think there will be a whole host of challenges that needs to unpack. And then I think that's where ultimately rubber will hit the road in terms of how far Quad-like grouping can go. So far, everything we've seen is very positive. I think Quad groupings conversation has been very inclusive and focusing very much more on the positive side of the message as opposed to against such and such side of the message. But I think that is really where the crucial point, the decision point will happen for the not only outside of the Quad grouping, but the those of the countries that are actually in the Quad grouping.
Unmute. Thank you. Those are all, I think, really good points. And I think maybe the point is to try to keep the Quad together but flexible. And I think Dhruva made the point that, you know, we really do need to focus on the security cooperation. That is the thing that has maybe become the most evolved over the lifetime of the Quad, over the last 20 years. But we also, I think it was clear from the summit outcomes and the joint statement that they want to focus on a positive program too. We can't, I think it was the Indian president who said we can't be against something, we have to be for something, right? So in that spirit, we have we have about 10 more minutes before we wrap up. We have a request from our board member, John Knorton, for Rory to hold up his book again because he couldn't catch the title and wanted to see the cover again. So we want to make sure, Rory, that since you're beaming in all the way from Australia, you get due props for your book out on the exact topic that we're discussing. And then we also have a question about sort of what can a forward-leaning agenda for the Quad kind of look like? Like, what are some of the, if we're brainstorming here and we're being creative and trying to come up with some things, of course, right now, COVID-19 is on everybody's mind. Certainly technology is a pretty future-oriented, I think, agenda item, but it's pretty broad. This person is asking about, I can't find the question now. I think Tyler Johnson wanted to know, for example, digital currency partnerships. Would that be something that the Quad could work on? Is there an effort in rare earth supply chains or coordinating supply chains so that we can all make sure that we have diversified access to critical inputs for manufacturing and products? So I don't know if anyone has a brilliant idea that they want to surface here in our group, but here's your chance to get your oar in with the administrations of these 4 countries and come up with other than the 3 working groups that they've already set up, maybe something within those working groups or something different. So maybe, I don't know, Professor Hosoya, do you want to take that first and give us your thoughts on the future work plan?
Right. Yeah, perhaps recently China's published a report on technology alliance to deepen a cooperation among liberal democracies which share a kind of a mutual trust to promote high technology cooperation. And I think that the Quad can do these kind of things because nowadays it is more and more difficult for countries to collaborate with China for particularly on the sensitive technology issues. In the sense, I think that the Quad can become a quite important framework because Quad is based on the mutual trust and the sharing values. That's why we have so many things to do, like, well, cooperation on digital currency. And well, of course, it will be difficult to radically transform supply chains, which involve Japan. But on the other hand, like the UK last year, abandoned to introduce Huawei 5G system, I think that like among the G7 country as well, we are now little by little transforming this kind of a supply chain among like-minded countries and among mutually trusted partners. Of course, this doesn't necessarily exclude China because, of course, in some areas, China is really trustworthy partners. So in that sense, I think that we can put some kind of trust element in this kind of supply chain or business transaction. And I think that the Quad can show this kind of new trend.
That brings up a point, I guess, about whether or not there's anything that we should be looking to do with China. And in the question box, there's also a question about how should we think about Russia in the context of the Quad. That's probably way too much for us to cover in the last few minutes here. But why don't I go to you, Dhruva, and then I'll come to Rory and Yuki. You can have the last word. Go ahead, Dhruva.
Thank you. In terms of the agenda, there are 4 areas at least that the Quad has mentioned in joint statements that are not subject to, or at least not directly subjected to, the 3 working groups that have been formed. I'll just briefly mention some of them. One is supply chain resilience. And a little while ago, about over a year ago, Japan, India, and Australia set up a supply chain resilience initiative partly in the context of COVID to see where they could cooperate. And this is led by their commerce or trade ministries or the trade arm of their governments. So that's sort of one of the efforts that is underway. Cyber cooperation is another one, and I suspect focusing on defense measures. In late 2019, there was a meeting of subject matter experts from the 4 Quad countries on cyber cooperation. So that's another effort that is underway. Infrastructure financing is another one. There are very similar concerns about Belt and Road Initiative. Here, in this case, Japan, Australia, and the US have been sort of leading the effort. There's been cooperation with Blue Dot Network. India is sort of been coordinating, but I think a lot of as India develops its own overseas infrastructure financing capabilities, which have grown significantly, but are still quite modest. There will be sort of some need to improve that coordination. And then finally, counterterrorism, I think, has been another area where there has been some subject, but not a whole lot in the public domain. Finally, so that's in terms of sort of widening the agenda and sort of what more could be done. The other element is sort of deepening the agenda at least on the security cooperation side, and a couple of areas that come to mind. One is joint research and development of defense. Again, a lot of this is being done on a bilateral basis, and currently the US has the best relationship with each of the 3 countries than they do amongst each other. So I think one of the challenges going forward will be how Japan, India, and Australia amongst themselves can actually work more closely in terms of defense R&D. And then the other is sort of the development of hard assets and the sharing of hard assets. So, there's been some exploration of the consequences of Australia developing the Cocos Keeling Islands or Christmas Island, and what the consequences are. Perhaps Roy can speak to that to some extent. For India, it's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Japan has an overseas facility now in Djibouti embedded in the United States base there. The US, of course, has assets around the world. So how can they best leverage those assets? Where will there be sensitivities? And there are still a lot of sensitivities in all four countries. Finally, I think just in response to one of the questions that was asked, one thing to look back on is, why wasn't this done sooner? Why has this taken so long? And one of the reasons is I think there need to be reassurances in all four countries that none of the partners would use the Quad as a bargaining chip with China. That when relations got better, that would lead to a scaling down of participation in quadrilateral activities. And I think we've reached that point now where the trust level is high enough, where there isn't that fear in India that Australia would use this as a bargaining chip, or in the United States that India would use this as a bargaining chip. And indeed, officials have over the past few weeks explicitly said that they will not sort of downgrade activities just out of deference to or out of a change in signaling from China. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. There was a question about that, but I think that has been quite explicitly answered by officials.
Well, yeah, and it certainly will make it easier not to use it as a bargaining chip if it has. I mean, I think this is the whole idea behind the sort of positive side of the ledger, right? Because there's no reason to not do it if you've got all these positive work programs going on. But on the other hand, if it's just seen as a counter China, then it becomes a little bit more fragile, I think. So I think that is a very wise way to go about developing the work plan going forward. Rory, over to you.
Thanks so much to talk about. Look, I think that the problem for the Quad going forward is not going to be a desperate search for things to do. It's going to be exactly the opposite. There's potentially a massive agenda here, and we've already seen a very ambitious agenda rolled out in the joint statement after the summit. So just living up to that agenda of COVID, climate, technology and so forth, plus maintaining the military exercises under Malabar, plus the political dialogue, that's a big start. And in fact, I would argue that there is a need for something of a secretariat to help coordinate, support and drive this. And I've even proposed that Australia should host that, not over bureaucratising it, but just providing that little bit of bureaucratic ballast, I think, that it needs. Going forward, though, I'd argue that the Quad should also be all about coordinating and deconflicting and burden sharing among the many important things that the four partners are already doing and are doing with others in areas like capacity building for states in Southeast Asia, in the South Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, to help them make their own choices strategically, economically, diplomatically, sharing an operating picture of the maritime environment. I think Dhruva's point about the fact that Quad countries have extraordinary capabilities and reach between them in their maritime operating picture and indeed their real estate in much of the island territories of the region. And I would add France as a critical partner for that in the Indian Ocean. There's plenty there to do. I don't think we need to reach a point where we say the Quad is done, this is the agenda is set. It's going to remain a work in progress. And last of all, how does the Quad engage with, for example, China and Russia? Look, I don't think at any point Quad countries would say there's a crisis facing the region, there's a natural disaster, there's a pandemic, we won't play with others. I think on the contrary, the Quad is about building a big four-island archipelago of trust now, which we've done. And it's now really about setting the terms for cooperation with others. And the choice now as to whether to cooperate or compete with the Quad is actually a choice for the likes of China or Russia to make.
Very good point there on the to end on. And Yuki, over to you.
Great, thank you. And once again, before I close, thank you again for hosting us. And it's great to be share panel with you, my co-panelists. So thank you. Just quickly to respond to the what are the potential areas that forward-leaning areas that Quad can start conversation on. Dhruva mentioned cyber, which I fully agree, but then also would highlight space. as well as the new emerging area, which does have both national security application, but then also scientific exploration aspect of it. And then I think these 4 countries do have a room to start a conversation, and it also includes other countries that have a stake in maintaining space as also as an open public good space. So I think I would just highlight that as a potential area. And then I think I like to reiterate, and some of that really falls on the U.S. too, because U.S. is, if anything, has probably the most complicated bilateral relationship with China. That interest spans across the globe, and it has all 3 elements of a relationship in one. And oftentimes, because U.S. is the biggest kid on the block, I think what we do does matter, and then I think impact profoundly on how other our allies and partner will respond or examine or recalibrate their approach to big challenge like China. So I think the kind of a homework starts from us almost, that U.S. needs to continue to reassure allies, remain steady, and be as transparent as possible as we continue to struggle by ourselves, strike this a delicate balance of how to really assert and calls China out on some of the undesirable and unfavorable and disruptive practices, but at the same time still don't completely shut the door on China and allow allies and partners to have some wiggle room to explore their own relationship with China.
Definitely, definitely a complicated picture, but I like what you said at the beginning. Walking the talk is a good start, and that's where we're at. And I think we'll continue, as everyone has said, to push this particular initiative forward. And I think everyone seems to be quite excited about the potential for it. So I really want to thank all of you for being here with us today. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I hope you all also learned something, got something out of it, and we'll continue to watch the development of this really important and even historic, as has been mentioned, development. So Susan, I don't know if you want to close us out here, but thank you again, everyone.
I just would reiterate, this again is a new area of discussion for the National Committee, but one that we will continue to have dialogue on, because just in the last hour and a half, you've raised so many important points for our 4 countries to work together. So thanks to all of you. Thanks for spending your morning or evening with us, and we look forward to more conversations.